evening, and welcome to COVID-19 Mental Health and Wellness Program. Tonight's workshop is entitled COVID and You, Grief and Loss During Times of Crisis. This series of workshops is brought to you by RER Consulting Enterprises, Barry University, New Horizons Community Mental Health Center, and Miami-Dade County. The program's objectives is to assist Miami-Dade County residents navigate the myriad of challenges during and post the COVID-19 pandemic, with an emphasis on the wide spectrum of mental health related issues associated with trauma, disasters, and pandemics. If at any time you have questions or comments, please feel free to utilize the Q&A feature on the lower screen, or if you are streaming via Facebook, drop your question below on the My Mental Miami page. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Maria Tian, and I am a licensed clinical social worker, associate dean, and assistant professor at Barry University School of Social Work. My practice and research surrounds trauma and traumatic grief and loss, health disparities, and working with first responders. Today, joining me is a colleague, Professor Carrie Daniels. And Carrie, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'd be happy to. Thank you, Dr. Tihan. Hi, everybody. Good evening. My name is Instructor Daniels. I've been with Barry University as an instructor for 5 years. I just got my certificate in the mail yesterday to remind me of that fact. And it's been a real honor to be a part of the faculty. I'm in the PhD program, so I am pursuing my doctorate. And my particular research area is in disenfranchised grief, currently going on in nursing home facilities and taking a look at the COVID-19 crisis in those facilities. My background, I'm an LCSW as well, licensed, and a certificate in thanatology, which is death, dying, and bereavement, which I know sounds like an oxymoron, but I really embrace the work of death, dying, and bereavement. And so looking forward to tonight's conversation with Dr. Tihan, who happens to be a model and a mentor for me. So thank you, Dr. Tihan, and I'll let you take it over.
Thank you, Carrie. It's an honor and pleasure to be working with you. Carrie and I are really honored to be with you, all of you here tonight, and what we hope is a way to join our community towards a path of wellness. Since our first workshop back in October, when we addressed the beginning of COVID-19 and the toll it's taken on our community, we find ourselves once again riding this roller coaster between the heights of hoping for a resolution and a vaccine, and the depths of despair, as we're now hearing we're entering a second wave and numbers have begun to rise. As of yesterday, I did some research, and as of yesterday, locally in Miami-Dade, we have gone up to 200,000 people of our community testing positive. And the numbers continue to grow. In 2 days, we went from 991 of our community members testing positive to almost 2,000. And this is especially sobering when we know that we have, as recent as September 27th, we were down to 77 residents. So one of the points we want to stress today, and I think you're going to hear this often throughout our workshop, is the importance of continuing to take this pandemic seriously. Some of the most vulnerable of our community, people of color, our young people, our elders, are being impacted at an alarming rate. And we encourage you to please continue to wear your masks, use physical distancing, wash your hands, and just be aware and continue to be informed. In fact, if you want to follow the COVID dashboard, then please, out of the health department, then you can go to our website, which is mymentalhealthmiami.org. But today's focus is going to be on grief and loss. And so let's start a little bit here, and I'm going to share our PowerPoint that Carrie and I put together. So today, as we talk about grief and loss, we want to first, of course, welcome you. We want to remind you that here's our agenda. What we're hoping to accomplish today is to address why are we talking about it? Why is this important? Types of grief and loss, and how does grief manifest in our life? We hope to have you join us in sharing some of perhaps your stories and questions for us. and then to talk a little bit about our last future workshop that we will be having in a couple of weeks. So why talk about grief and loss? I think one of the reasons that is really important that we bring this topic forward is that I'm not sure that people often understand the idea that through the pandemic, there's a foundational experience that we're having, and that is a reaction that we are experiencing is really one that is grief-centered. And when we enter a critical event in our lives, it filters everything we see. It changes our worldview. And so one of the things, I think one of our main messages we want for you all to hear today is the idea of validating where you are. There's a lot of questions that we often get, and is how do you work through grief? And there isn't a way to avoid it. And if we can try to avoid this journey, we can try to defer it. But grief has a funny way of kind of, tapping us on the shoulder or hitting us below the knees and saying, I'm here. You have to deal with us. You have to deal with me. And I often talk about grief almost as if it's an entity, because it feels like this thing has come into our lives and it has changed our worldview. So I came up with this kind of little acronym called VINES, and it's not in any particular order, but I first encourage you to validate and honor where you are, acknowledge what you're feeling, lean into those emotions, and appreciate that you're experiencing something that is intrinsically human and certainly normal. The second piece of that is to help identify. We're hoping that some of the things we're learning today and that we're dialoguing together, that you'll help to identify what you're experiencing. You may often hear when something happens that people say, I'm in shock, or I'm numb, I don't know what I'm feeling. And oftentimes that's interpreted as meaning that people are feeling nothing. But I believe that the opposite is actually true. When people are saying that they're in shock or they're numb, it's not that there's absence of feeling, it's that there's a flooding of feeling, there's a flooding of emotion, and therefore it's overwhelming, and they're not really sure what to feel, and nor do they know how to express that. So helping yourself to identify those emotions can help you break it down into small pieces so that they're more manageable. So for example, kind of reflecting, today I'm feeling angry, today I'm feeling frightened, and therefore you can kind of take those emotions and address them one by one, as opposed to having this chaotic, overwhelming sense of unease and not really sure where to move through that. I talked about normalizing the experience. Although everyone's grief journey and path that we are experiencing through this pandemic is unique, there is a sense of universality to it, which is those emotions we're feeling, scared, frightened, angry, and so forth, are normal. So please give yourself the gift of knowing that what you're feeling is okay. It's normal. You're not going crazy. This is exactly your response. It's your normal response to an abnormal situation. And in essence, that's really the definition of trauma. Finally, expressing it. Again, what we're hoping to also bring to you later on tonight and also in our last workshop is the idea of helping you to know ways that you can express it in a healing and healthy manner, so that doing something that might be harmful to yourself or others is obviously not a healthy way to respond to this grief process, but doing something that can create opportunities for healing, opportunities for acknowledgement, for validation is certainly something that is important. And finally, in this idea, when you look at this VINE acronym that I came up with, and it's inserted into that or embedded in this process is kind of like a framework of not being able to separate the mind from the body and the spirit. We enter our grief journey in with everything that we are as human beings, and therefore our minds are impacted, our bodies are impacted, and certainly our spirit is impacted. So as part of that, learning how to create opportunities to regulate your body, regulate those emotions that you're feeling is really important. And again, we'll talk more about that later on in the workshop tonight. But learning to breathe, learning how to calm ourselves, learning how to lean into those emotions in a healing way to lead us into recovery. And I hope that our message is not lost here with the acknowledgement and of the pain of this process and this journey that we're going through. I hope you also hear the message of healing, that we intrinsically believe in people's ability to heal and in people's ability for resiliency. So with that, I'm going to segue into Carrie taking us a little bit further deeper into this idea of regulation and how the body and the spirit and the mind work together.
This VINES is such a fantastic acronym to remember. And I like, she also said hopefulness in the healing. And let me piggyback. Imagine a vine is a way out of a darker area. You climb the vine out of your grief experience. And so that's another way to kind of take away the nugget of hope and gratitude through this, grief process. It can be a very, not an easy conversation to have. And talking about grief as an entity, that's like brilliant because I look at it as an uninvited guest. And what grief brings is stress. So you can see this model of stress, and Ria's going to show this very briefly and then take us back to have a conversation about distress and eustress. Stress, the body doesn't recognize if stress is good or bad. Distress is the bad part of stress, and eustress is positive stress. So if you go to a wedding or a funeral, your body doesn't differentiate. It responds to it. And it responds to it unconsciously and automatically. Why? Because your brain is built for survival. It's evolved that way. So you thank your brain because your body automatically does what it does. In the nervous system, there's two parts we're going to talk about very briefly tonight: the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. You see, Hans Sales was a researcher back in the 1950s that came up with this general adaptation syndrome. Using the nervous system, wants to stay in a place of equilibrium, where the sympathetic nervous system gets activated when you perceive a threat and you're ready to fight it off or you're going to run away from it. And it reaches down to a place called the pituitary gland and gets some cortisol, some stress hormones to fight that threat, right? And it takes a lot of energy. So luckily the body's brilliant too. It has a parasympathetic, the rest and digest section that allows us to have quality of life by breathing and relaxing and being able to digest our food and be with people and engage. We do this, we balance every day, every hour. Our nervous systems are built to kind of balance each other out. Problem is, with COVID-19 and the social unrest, this happens. We're all unbalanced. Chronic stress gets activated and really plays havoc with our bodies. And we're going to talk a little bit in some other slides about how it does play havoc on that. So let me go into not only stress is something universally felt, globally felt because of the pandemics, but it's also a personal experience based on 3 E's. So I'll let Dr. Tihan take us back for a visual. And I know you're not seeing my face, but that's fine. It's important to take a look at the 3 E's here. How we respond to trauma through our grief reactions and our stress reactions depends on the kind of event we're talking about. I think we can all agree that a pandemic is a pretty big deal, right? It's catastrophic, in fact. So the event is larger than, let's say, a fender bender, a car accident, or a stress job. But these stresses could vary on their scale of severity for each individual, because everybody experiences their events differently, as unique as your thumbprint on your fingers. So from, let's say, a scale of 0 to a 10, we all experience different levels on the event itself, and that's including the pandemic and the social unrest. You all have a very personal number there on that scale and that continuum, and that's great. because that there's no shame or blame there. Everybody, if you have a real big reaction to just having to be socially isolated, and somebody else is like, that's no big deal. I love staying at home and working from work. Let us know that your experience is as individual as you are. And the effects of the trauma in the situation now is if personal, emotional, mental. If you're physically sick because of COVID-19, or God forbid you have somebody that died because of COVID-19, the effects are going to be different for you than somebody else that might not have had any of those particular effects. So we want to mention that. And, Maria, pipe in if there's something I'm leaving out as we move into the types of grief.
You're doing great.
So if you want to throw back up there a visual for the audience on the types of grief, there's a list of them. And I'm not going to go over all the list, but I'm going to highlight a few, especially because we have the holidays coming up. So here it is. Let me just go over the fact, let's pick out the normal grief. I don't even like that word normal, because what is normal really? How we can look at normal in its definition when it's with grief is it if you're moving towards a place of being able to heal and let go and move forward with quality of your life. If you get stuck, these other reactions are not abnormal. It's just gives you a definition of where to start. We have to name it to feel it. I'm borrowing that from David Kessler, a famous grief researcher. And I also say we have to feel it to heal it. That's me saying that. So anticipatory grief, for example, could be something you're going through right now, like Dr. Tihan so nicely identified, the spikes, right? Right now, the COVID statistics are climbing. Your body's probably, even as I say that, your body might be reacting to that. It's anticipating, what now? Are we going to shut down again? Is my job going to have to lay people off? All of these anticipatory things are anticipatory grief. There's a real grief associated with that. Let me also pick out ambiguous loss and grief. And grief, by the way, is a response to our losses. But ambiguous loss and grief was brought up by a person named Pauline Boss. And you can look at catastrophic examples like missing persons. The person's missing, but psychologically, you don't know if they're dead or not dead. This could also be applied to psychological loss, but physical presence. It's like Alzheimer's dementia. The person is there physically, but psychologically and personality-wise, they're not. So Pauline Boss reminds us holding two opposing ideas at the same time, absence and presence, is really hard to do, and it's what we're all doing. This ambiguous, invisible virus surrounds us like background noise on the TV, always omnipresent. So you can't get even grounded to reflect what are we supposed to let go of and what are we supposed to grieve. And really quickly, the other piece of that is we're not socially connected to get cues from our fellow human beings on how we're supposed to respond to that. And that could be something called very disenfranchising. Disenfranchised grief is my big thing. It's really where I am examining that further in my research. It's when society...
Excuse me, before you get into disenfranchised, I want to kind of go back a little bit to ambiguous, because I think your points about connecting that with COVID is so on target. And I think that it's a good time to talk about why that is. And I think it's that idea of, ambiguous grief being that kind of grief that really, as you stated, is not known. And I think that that's part of that whole conversation about COVID. I think part of the reason that we're all experiencing our reactions to the level that we are is because usually when there's a critical event or we have a loss in our life, it's usually there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And with COVID, especially now that we're entering in the second wave, I think that that's part of the struggle we're all experiencing. We see this huge staircase with no ending, and we don't know how can we, how do we respond? When can this be finished? How do we kind of close the loop to it? And I believe that that's part of the grief response we're having, is that it's very hard to see an end period. And again, when we talk about, stress and coping strategies, we'll go into that. But I think, again, trying to break that down into that piece instead of seeing the whole staircase, looking at that first step and focusing on that first step can certainly be a move towards healing. But when you talked about ambiguous loss, it really connected with me that it's so COVID appropriate. I know we often talk about that in terms of losses like for example, a death that may not, you may, especially a traumatic death where you may not have been able to find the person, or something like Alzheimer's or something like that, because you lose that individual from a mental perspective, even though their body is there. But I think this COVID really fits really nicely into that. So I'm glad you brought that forward. And I just wanted to kind of support that.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Tihan. And I love visuals. So what she was describing as far as ambiguous loss, there's no end to it. Like a snow globe, it kind of looks like this for us in the world. And as you see, as the little snowflakes settle, there's that end. But it's like second peak, here we go again. And we're all kind of struggling through the chaos of all of it. And I agree. I think ambiguous loss is really describing the COVID-19 pandemic for sure. And it can be just really quickly disenfranchising. If we don't name it, we don't know how to feel about it. How can we possibly grieve it? So we might not even feel we should be grieving. We don't even know what to grieve. So we can self-disenfranchise. In other words, disenfranchised grief is when we either tell ourselves or society tells us that that's not appropriate to grieve. Examples would be not COVID related, death of a pet, LGBT plus community not allowed to go to the funerals because they're not identified family members. It could be a woman's choice to have an abortion, but then she's grieving that, miscarriages, etc. So disenfranchise is very sad. And Maria and myself in a couple of slides in the future are going to talk about it's not okay to grieve in isolation. We have to find ways to stay connected, especially through our loss and our grief experiences. So really briefly, we'll show you a slide on the types of losses. Grief is our response to loss. And we were talking about there's death and non-death losses. So there's like physical losses of a person. There's also psychological losses that we were kind of describing as well. And you'll see some other ones written down here. And you'll know, especially if you're going through some of those losses, if you were furloughed, you lost your job, well, that's a financial loss and it's an identity loss, right? So we have to think about grief and loss a little outside the box. All of these life transitions, remember that stress, general adaptation syndrome, life stresses, good and bad, create a stress and therefore create a need to find a way to move through the stress in an effective manner.
I wanted to kind of bring up in terms of types of losses and that connection of types of grief too. I think we're entering a period of time that really I think it's important for us to talk about. And I know you had it on your slide, and that is the holidays, because I think the holidays really bring a special time of loss, and especially now as we're entering the second wave, where we're hearing no more than 10 people, no more, don't travel, stay home. And of course, for most Americans, that is, unheard of, especially on Thanksgiving. It's such a special time. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, your thoughts in terms
Absolutely.
of holidays and how grief can manifest that in that way.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Tihan. Most definitely. Here we're going into the holiday season. Thanksgiving is upon us next week. And as Dr. Tihan was saying, for a lot of us, we traditionally have had tons of family and friends over for that big meal. And now we're being told by the CDC, and they have a great website there that gives you tips to how to navigate the holidays, by the way. I encourage you to go there. How to do it safely and cautiously, especially because of the peaks. And it's doable. And the first thing is to give yourself permission to do a holiday self-care plan where you either can say no or you can modify your traditional way. Now's the time to create new rituals, new holidays, and we can turn it around in even a positive way. If you look at those big family meals, that's a lot of preparation, a lot of work, and maybe some relatives you really don't want at your dinner table. But this season, you have the option to create a different type of holiday. Maybe it's just with a real small unit that you live with. And then you make that so entirely fabulous and special with games, and you go deep into those connections with the people that you're already housed with and you know that's safer already. And then maybe you invite the relatives with a Zoom or technology. If you have the access to these wonderful things, gives us the ability to reach out in a different way. So now's the time to make new and different types of rituals because that's really meaningful and important.
And I think absolutely. I think there's a blessing connected to this, which creates opportunities and not just challenges, as you said, opportunities for new ways of celebrating, new ways of remembering, new ways of honoring our loved ones, both those that have passed and those that are still with us. And I also want to bring forward that in terms of this grief process, we didn't go into COVID um, in a vacuum. So we bring to each experience, when you talk about, you know, the definition of trauma, and you talk about experience and effect and so forth, there we come into these experiences with everything we are. So with our values, with our ethnicity, our culture, our rituals, and our beliefs. And I think that one of the things that's really important is to understand that there might be other losses attached to the pandemic, and that we may have incurred, not just because of the pandemic, but through the pandemic. So for example, things like, you know, people may have died, but there are other losses that we often don't talk about, or that people may not perceive as losses necessarily. They see it as something that has changed, right? So for example, jobs may have been touched, and you mentioned that in terms of furlough, but just changing your everyday, you know, activities, right? So for those of us who are parents, for example, we all of a sudden had to be educators in, you know, 24 hours or less, it felt like, and all of a sudden we also had to, you know, take care of our business, take care of homes, but also take care of our kids and their educational, you know, work, and that was a change. And so there was a lot of losses that may have been connected, and life didn't stop because of COVID. We still had to pay bills. We still had to go shopping. We still had to do, you know, do groceries and so forth. And I think part of the loss of connected to COVID isn't just COVID, but life that just naturally occurred and didn't stop. And so it was these layers of losses that continued. And perhaps unlike before, I know with a lot of my clients that I've been talking to, part of their struggle is that not only were they having to deal with the fear of COVID, but the idea that everything that around us changed. So even our resources that we may have been using, you know, in the past were impacted. So for example, something like, I know that one of the things that I read was happening is that people with chronic illnesses, for example, there was an expectation that those individuals may actually have gotten worse simply because they couldn't go to their physicians. And so those were things, those are losses that we usually don't talk about, these kind of intangible kinds of losses. So I think that when we talk about, you know, the types of losses, I think we need to bring forward that we don't go into these journeys in a vacuum, and therefore how we filter them, how we perceive them, how we respond or react to them is uniquely our own. I think in terms of COVID, it's multi-layered and certainly cumulative. So
Let me jump in there too, Maria. Let's not
yeah,
forget spirituality. You just
yeah,
tweaked a memory. How powerful. I mean, I personally cope in that direction. But when the churches, synagogues, mosques get shut down, or they're now reopened, but maybe limited, and you still have that fear factor. So that's huge. That could be a real big coping mechanism. And how do we shift that and get that back in our lives in a different way? So
exactly.
really well put, Dr. Tian. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carrie. And so you kind of helped me segue into our next slide, which is how does grief manifest itself in our lives? And so I wanted to bring forward, again, bringing that mind, body, spirit, physical, mental, and behavioral and emotional. And people react to grief in a different way, and grief is painful. I believe that one of the most painful aspects of grief is this idea that we have that perhaps our connection or our bond, either with our loved one or with that thing or that other person that we had, is broken. And indeed, I think part of our healing is when we realize that it's not a connection that is broken, but it's our relationship having to change in a different way. And so I think that that's something that resonates with me, especially when we keep hearing this term, social distancing, keep social distancing. And although computer technology has allowed us to maintain a connection, I think human beings are born with this need to kind of, be connected to each other in a much more physical way. And I think that, and so I've stopped using that term, social distancing. I know it might be splitting hairs, and I see you, shaking your head. Yes, I know that this is something that you also feel strongly about, Carrie. And I try to use that term in terms of physical distancing, because I think we can continue to have those bonds and that social connection, which I think we desperately need now more than ever. Even though we have to, for safety's sake, maintain physical distance. So in terms of how loss can manifest in our life physically, it literally can show up in our bodies through headaches, through stomach aches, through physical pain, literally physical pain. You may experience it through the kind of in the continuum of emotions. You might be experiencing more or less. So what I mean by that is you might find yourself eating more or eating less, sleeping more or sleeping less. And both of those are certainly normal responses depending on your own unique journey. So don't be frightened if you have this kind of experience, because it's your body expressing an emotional aspect of our human journey. And it's normal. It's scary, it's frightening sometimes. You're not aware, you're not sure of what's happening, but know that grief can actually manifest itself through pain in our body. Mentally and emotionally, it can manifest in terms of sadness, of course, anxiety, general depression. You might find yourself in bouts of crying or having grief pangs, which are kind of like these short, temporary periods of intense distress. They can reoccur intermittently, and you'll find yourself feeling these emotions really intensely for these short period of time. You also may have these sense of disbelief. And I also mentioned earlier numbness or this kind of sense of shock or disbelief. It didn't happen, it can't be happening. And certainly I know that in my own process, when I first started hearing about, COVID-19, I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's something that's happening over there. And I have family in Italy, and I remember them calling and saying, oh, this is happening here. And I'm like, I was frightened for them, but I'm like, well, that's not going to happen here. And here in my own naivete, in my own world of safety. And when that safety
you talk about your snow globe, when that globe is broken and you don't find yourself safe anymore because you find that COVID not only came, it came with raging, in a raging manner. It creates a sense of dis-ease in us, and a sense of our safety has been broken, and then we feel vulnerable to it. And at the heart, I think, of grief is this sense of vulnerability to it. We're not used to being vulnerable to this kind of loss. And I think that that's very important to bring forward. And finally, behaviorally, because what we might be finding is that these emotional aspects of grief can lead to behavioral changes in us. So you might find that you're doing things differently. You may be afraid even to go grocery shopping because the message has been, social distance, stay safe, and you're afraid to do your normal everyday routine. So you find your routines changing, and that certainly can happen. You might find that your tolerance for things or for certain people have changed, where perhaps you might have tolerance for, let's say, your next door neighbor who usually, is a little difficult to live with, but hey, you deal with it. And now your tolerance for that individual no longer exists, because when we talk about grief work, that word work is really important, because it is work. It is actually fuel that you're using. It's emotional fuel, physical fuel, spiritual fuel that you're using in order to be able to move through the day. When we go into a grief response, our world has shifted. Something has changed, and we have to have acknowledgement of that in some way. And so therefore, you feel depleted, and things that might have taken you might find that things that might have taken you 5 minutes to do are not taking you a whole day to do, because things that used to be perhaps achievable are now feeling insurmountable. And again, it's normal. It doesn't feel good, but it's normal. And so then finally, in terms of how it can manifest in our lives, I've talked about, the emotional reactions, the everyday intrusions and responsibilities that we have intruding and and feeling depleted, that sense of discomfort and disbelief and the anxiety that might lead. But finally, this idea of spiritual pain. And oftentimes we may not talk about spiritual pain a lot, but there's this sense of feeling that vulnerability, especially if you're a person who has a center of spirituality and has perhaps even a faith tradition you follow. You might find yourself raging, at God or at the Creator or at whatever higher power you believe in, and you find that there's this sense of, why are you allowing this to happen? Why is this occurring? And although I obviously can't answer those questions, certainly I'm not a theologist, but I think that there is a sense of us accepting and understanding that along with our physical, mental, and emotional and behavioral pain, acknowledge and give yourself the gift of knowing that there's also a sense of spiritual pain that can come with grief. On the other piece of it, and in terms of manifesting the grief in our lives, I also want to bring forward, because oftentimes I think when we talk about grief, we see it as a negative. But I do want to bring forward that through the sense of grief, as there's a sense of also healing and learning. And so along with each of these areas of manifestation, I want to also say that there's opportunities for growth in the loss of it. And then certainly in terms of spirituality, there's that spiritual pain piece of it, but we also know that research is showing that spirituality and having a sense of meaning and a sense of a higher power in our lives actually is a protective factor in healing. So I think those are some thoughts that I wanted to bring forward. Any other things that you think I've missed, Carrie, that you want to
I want to
Yeah.
highlight the fact that she's normal. Dr. Tian, you're normalizing a lot of stuff that grievers feel like they're going crazy. They describe to me when I do my bereavement groups as, do I have early dementia? Because I'm forgetting everything. I can't work. Everything, like you were saying, people just cannot function. And it is a very normal reaction. I think that helps that you're not alone in these kinds of things. So I really appreciated that you said that, and how grief, that uninvited friend, guest, grief can pop in when you least expect it. Like you're
Mhm.
going to the grocery store thinking you're just going to get a can of beans, but for some reason that can remind you of something, maybe that occurred during the pandemic, or about the fact that you might have gotten furloughed or lost your job or financially got cut. And then you just cry out of nowhere. And it can be very unexpected and a little unsettling. A lot of grievers share that experience. And so the tips we're going to get to a little bit this time, but for sure next week, kind of
Mhm.
talks about how can you pour a little bit of grief out at a time frame so that it doesn't overwhelm you and pop at you unexpectedly.
So let me bring up that word unexpectedly and briefly share this next slide, which we titled "A Unique Component of Loss Due to a Death During COVID." And I think for us, this was I think out of all the slides, perhaps even, I think besides the coping one, is probably one of the most important slides we have and one of the most simplest. And that is the reality of how COVID has impacted how we address loss. But in this particular slide, I think we wanted to bring forward specifically in terms of our cultural aspects of death and dying. Because as we went through COVID and we lost people and our family and friends and loved ones may have died because of COVID. Something strange started to happen, something that people were not expecting, and that is the inability to be present, inability to visit people in the hospital, inability to have a regular celebration of life, and a coming home ceremony, and acknowledging our loved ones and their memories in the way that was important to our culture and to our faith. And so I wonder, what your thoughts are, because I know one of the things that was very important in terms of acknowledging loss is that validation. And when I talked earlier about the idea of knowing that our bonds are not broken, but that our relationship with our loved ones change as we move into our healing, when you talk about a severing of a bond or a connection, I think that my clients and certainly family members, I had an aunt die during about a month ago. And I know that for us, my family is Latin, and for us, it was culturally and in terms of our faith tradition, unforeseeable and unacceptable that we wouldn't be able to be with her during her hospital stay. In my family, it's common that a member of the family stays with someone every day that they're in the hospital. That wasn't possible. So a lot of the normal rituals and connections that we would have made as a family were disrupted and severed. And then, of course, when she died, we weren't there, but we had a powerful social worker actually who at least brought us into the room through the technology. And that certainly assuaged some of our own, feelings about not being present. But I wonder what your thoughts are, Professor Daniels, in terms of this unique process that happened with COVID that I don't think we really expected until all of a sudden it just started to exponentially, rise, and it became a reality in our lives in terms of grief and loss.
Help if I unmute myself. Thank you, Dr. Tihan. This is a really big thing. Dr. Tihan said a couple of slides ago, that the fact that we were social creatures, we really need each other. And you see, we have this need so much so, it's for our survival, because that's really how we survived way back in the day when we were cavemen trying to get away from the saber-toothed tiger. We realized that we needed more than just one of us. We needed a pack. And neurobiologically, we are connected. So what this says is when we die, that's such a time that we need these meaningful rituals to connect with that loved one, to say goodbye to them and they say goodbye to us, or wherever we need and however we need to do that. We're robbed of that. It was taken away so abruptly, severed, like you said. And it's very concerning because that's the time, and sudden deaths do this too, by the way. It's not just
Yes.
COVID-19, but they're
Yes.
not having the ability to go to the bedside and have a vigil and say your goodbyes and have closure is a really beautiful thing with disease process. The bad news is you have to watch the disease process, where sudden deaths don't necessarily have that feature. But during COVID-19 specifically, and many people watching this know firsthand, like you do, Dr. Tihan, is that, that just gone. Now what do you do? And there are so many stories out there. And my research, as you know, is looking at what's happening in nursing homes. And over the summer, I was a facilitator for a nationwide support group for nursing home social workers. And they told us real-time stories about a couple. One had dementia, so was confused, didn't understand why she couldn't get to her husband, who was on the other side of that door, dying from COVID-19. And there's so many real-time stories about people without dementia being separated and not being able to have a final goodbye, or to do so with what do you call them, the notebooks, and with phones and with iPads and all these other technologies. Great. But it's not that neuroconnectivity as you speak about, being in the same presence with somebody. You can actually connect. There's these things called mirror neurons in the part of your brain that basically says you're wiring in with somebody. You're doing neuro Wi-Fi with people. And we're replacing that with Zoom, and we're learning still about, okay, how is this going to be moving forward? So let's make a big validation about how this is so significant and so heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking. And yet I want to validate, if this has been an experience of any one of our community members, that connection is no less. I know this sounds bizarre, but that connection or that opportunity to be with your loved one through a Zoom or through your phone or whatever is no less than if you were there present. Both Professor Daniels and I have, before we worked at Barry University, we both worked at hospices. And one of the things that I learned there from being privileged enough to be part of our patients' and families' journey at a time when I think is extremely sacred is that, and I believe with all my heart that even though we may not be physically present in the room with our loved ones, our spirits connect. That's the connection, that's the bond that I think cannot be severed. So I wanted to give this message to those of you out there who may not have had a chance to be physically present at your loved ones passing and transition, and know it, that you were there, and that they know you were there, because to us, love and connection and spirit transcends everything. And it's not less than. And what we had to find during this time is how to continue to honor our own path and what's important to us. And I think I know our loved ones know that we were there, and that they matter, and that they are loved. So I hope that message is out there, especially if you did not have a chance to be there physically. I also wanted to make, and I meant to make this disclaimer early on, and I don't want us to close up. I know we're almost ready to close up, but I don't want to close up without maybe making this disclaimer, because Carrie, people might find it strange that we are using the terms that we're using in terms of, loss and grief and death and dying, and we're using that language.
And so I wanted to explain that that is done purposefully. We believe, and actually research does actually support that we have to use the words instead of hiding behind it, because it does help when you use the word dead, death, dying, for example, as opposed to things like, maybe just passing away or something like that. It does help to remind us that there's been a change in the way that life was, is, and is going to be. And so I hope people know that it isn't us trying to offend or trying to throw things in their face, but it's this leaning in that I talked about early on. It's this acknowledgement, it's this validation of the loss. And in this particular incident, we're talking actually about death and dying. And so I wanted to explain why we use those words very specifically, as opposed to more the euphemistic kinds of words that people might usually use, which is perfectly okay. And then certainly you have to come into this process, into this journey, in what's comfortable for you and what your belief system is and what your values are. But in terms of us working in this field of grief and loss, you'll find it common that we tend to use these terms very purposefully and specifically. And so I hope that people are aware and now are aware, and not finding and not seeing us as uncaring or just kind of throwing things in their face. So anything, do you want to say anything else before we kind of move into our coping portion?
I just want to again emphasize the resiliency of the human spirit, like you said. And I think we're going to find out just how amazing that our connections are because of this, because we're forced to now, not be at the bedside. We're going to find out amazing things that are going to, because you and I have seen that. We've seen it firsthand with hospice.
Yes.
So I get what you're saying. And I'm really hopeful that this spirituality component that transcends things will be a new level of learning.
Beautiful, thank you. So let me go on to our next slide. Beautiful, thank you. So let me go on to our next slide kind of quickly. We are in this process where we talked a lot about, how grief impacts us, how it manifests in us, the types of losses and the types of grief, and the uniqueness of our grief journey as we dealt with not only our normal life changes and kind of roller coaster life that we all have, and then COVID also, and how uniquely that has impacted our grief and loss. So now we want to kind of move into, so what do we do about it? How do we help ourselves? How do we help each other? And before we talk about how we help, I think it's important to talk a little bit about some things, what not to say. Perhaps one of the questions that you might have is, so how do I help someone, or how do I help myself, or what do I say? I don't know what to say. And I thought that before we talked a little bit about some of the tools for coping, we would talk a little bit, Carrie, about some of the aspects of how to help people help others or help themselves. So for example, some of the things that that you want to try to avoid are things like, cliches, things like it happened, at least they had a full life. I had one of the most significant experiences happen to me when I worked at hospice. I was training some new employees, and one of the nurses there was so upset because she went to attend a death, and the person was 102 years old, and she thought she was offering the family some support. And she goes, oh my goodness, at least she had a long life. And the family just reacted so, painfully against that statement, because to them,
102 years old was still not long enough. This happened to be the matriarch of the family, and she kept the family together. So her loss was so significant, even at 102. So trying to avoid cliches, trying to ascribe your meaning or a meaning to a loss that may not have the same meaning to the person, saying how that you know how a person feels. That can lead people to, you don't know how I feel. You have no understanding or awareness. And this may be, again, strange, but trying to take the pain away too fast. That gut-wrenching hurt that we feel when something happens that hurts us is because we care about it. And whether it's a death or whether it's a loss of a job or a loss of a pet or a loss of identity, we hurt because we care. It's something we care about. If it's something we don't care about, it has no power over us, but we're vulnerable to a situation or to an issue or to a person because we care about it. We have a connection with it. So trying to take the pain of loss about that situation or about that feeling can invalidate that person's connection to that issue or that person. So again, I know it doesn't feel good when we see people we care about hurting, but sometimes as we move into, so what do we do? Sometimes all we have to do is be there. Sometimes just being present. And I'm going to stop sharing here in a minute, but sometimes just being present for the moment is more important than anything, because we can't take people's pain away, but we can walk that journey with them. We can let people know you're not walking this alone. So one of the ways that we want to bring forward in terms of helping yourself and others is being aware that just walking with them, being present, is sometimes some of the most, one of the most important things you can do, letting them know you're there. And if they need you, you're going to be right there. Again, it's not about taking away the pain of it, but it's knowing that you're not walking it alone. What are any other thoughts you have before we get into our coping strategies with that?
Nope, that was beautifully said.
Okay, so let's talk about coping. Carrie, you want to start with some of that, and I'll put the slide up again, and then I'm going to take it off a little so that people can see you better.
Sure, yeah, because I can grab it off of my hard copy.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I think we only have about 3 minutes left. So let me just kind of go into the coping. I think Grandma said it really great. Don't forget about the importance of exercise, eating well-balanced diet, and finding ways to force yourself to have a routine. And I know that's kind of not really, it's counterintuitive when you're grieving, you're feeling so off balanced, but getting back to that balance is getting to that structure and that routine. That you got to start somewhere, and that's a good place to start, is trying to find good ways to do that. And again, like Dr. Tehan said, find social connections somehow so you're not alone in your pain. The worst place to be is socially isolated with a lot of that really internal angst that she was describing. Even if you have a good friend, a colleague, somebody, it could be just a stranger. Some folks find a lot of help going out to get that counselor, that therapist, that person that's not a family member that can be just there to be that listener and to be that emotional container. I think we're going to go a lot more into this in more detail next week, so I don't want to do a spoiler alert, but we're going to do more experiential things in moving forward, how to cope, what these things look like, how to breathe, how to engage your parasympathetic nervous system, to relax yourself and to pace yourself. Of course, journaling is on the list, and the mindfulness thing is really what I'm excited about next week, Dr. Tehan.
Yes, I was going to say, next time we'll talk a little more about how to do some journaling, doing new rituals, doing the next best thing. Is if you can't do what you want exactly, then doing the next best thing. And with that, the awareness of, grief in terms of, Carrie talked about this in terms of remembering that human beings are incredibly resilient. The idea of when you talk about how to help someone
and how to help ourselves is remembering a hope for healing, that we believe in our deepest heart, again, not even so much because of our research, but because of us being privileged enough to work with our clients, and that is the power of hope and the power of meaning making, knowing that through this insanity, there's a sense of meaning to it. And so with that, one of the things we want to remind you is about our workshop coming up next week. We will be talking more at length about stress and managing stress, and reminding you all, and this will be on our website, that if indeed you find that you need professional support and help through your grief journey, please, please, please don't hesitate. There are so many organizations out in our community, hospices, Baptist Health, University of Miami, local faith-based, your churches, your synagogue, your mosque. Reach out to people. There's community people out there that are there to help. So please know you're not alone. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Thank you so much, Carrie. You're an incredible colleague and an intense human being. I thank you for joining me and teaching and learning always from you. So thank you, everyone. Blessings. Stay safe. Don't forget, wear your mask. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.